Hello, everybody. I think I may have been on mute prior to that or hadn't started the audio broadcast. This is Katie from Schoolhouse Connection, and welcome to our webinar. We are getting ready to start in just about a minute now. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. The time is 1 p.m. Eastern, so we are ready to start our webinar. Welcome to Be Attentive to Attendance, How Chronic Absenteeism Affects Students Experiencing Homelessness. We'll be together for the next 75 minutes, and we're so excited to have you join us today. A little bit of housekeeping at the outset. You should be able to see a platform on the side of your screen that has a couple different options within the dashboard, and one of those is our questions pane. The only folks who are able to speak on this webinar are myself and the co-presenters. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the questions pane. And we're going to reserve about 15 minutes at the end of our presentation to go through your questions. If for some reason we don't get through all of your questions, not to worry. We make sure to save all of the questions posed in the questions pane, and then we get to unanswered questions via a spreadsheet that I'll create, and then we'll distribute that via email and then also upload it to the Schoolhouse Connection and Education Leads Home websites, along with the PowerPoint, which is also accessible in the handout section of this of the dashboard for the GoToWebinar system. Hopefully you are aware that if this is relevant for you, completion of this webinar makes you eligible to earn CEUs. This is co-sponsored by the National Association for Social Work. Thank you so much to the NASW. There will be a link at the end of this webinar, and you can also access the link by, again, downloading the PowerPoint, which is available in the handout section. And to be eligible to earn the CEUs, you have to make sure to complete the post-test that's available at the link and also score at least an 80% on the post-test. Do not fear if for some reason you don't score an 80% on the first try, you are able to take the test as many times as necessary. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to mention those in the questions pane or email me separately after the fact. Again, this webinar is co-sponsored by Education Leads Home. We are the first and only national campaign seeking to improve educational systems and programs and supports for students experiencing homelessness from early childhood through post-secondary. And as part of that effort, we have three distinct goals. The first is related to early childhood. And as you can see on our screen, our aim is that young children will participate in quality early childhood programs at the same rate as their house peers by the year 2026. We look to working with students K through 12 and measure success with those students, not only by looking at academic achievement in the earlier grades, but also by looking at their high school graduation rate and aiming for a 90% graduation rate by 2030. And finally, our post-secondary students, we aim for a 60% attainment rate by 2034. You can learn more about Education Leads Home on our website. You can see the link right there. We have a whole host of resources on our website. This calendar year, we've focused our content on chronic absenteeism and identification. Next year, we'll be continuing some of that work and then also branching out into additional content areas, all related to these three goals. We have some beautiful blog posts, guest perspectives from both practitioners and students. One of our presenters today, Sue Lanahan, wrote a beautiful blog post describing her work with students experiencing homelessness in Michigan. I encourage you to take a look at powerful words from our constituents around the country through our website. You can learn more about the Partners in Education Leads Home by taking a look at any of these links. We include ICPH, Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness, Schoolhouse Connection, Civic, formerly Civic Enterprises, America's Promise Alliance, and Newly Education Council. Our presenters today include Jennifer Erb Downward from the University of Michigan's Poverty Solutions, Sue Lanahan, middle school counselor and homeless education local school district liaison from Big Rapids Public Schools in Michigan, Joseph Angaran, training director and national trainer with Check and Connect at the University of Minnesota. And again, my name is Katie. I'm the program manager for Education Leads Home with Schoolhouse Connection. And we're so happy to have all of our contributors here today and to hear from all of our participants in the questions pane. Briefly, today's agenda, we're going to provide a general overview of chronic absenteeism and its effects on students, specifically those experiencing homelessness. As part of that, we'll share a little bit of national chronic absenteeism data. And Jen will also share a case study via her work done in Michigan. Then we'll transition to looking at data through a more personal lens and talking about the importance of relationships as experienced by Sue in her work in Big Rapids. And then Joe will close us out by sharing the Check and Connect model and how Check and Connect leverages both data and mentorship and the importance of relationship in connecting with students experiencing homelessness and improving their attendance. We'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. With that, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll turn the mic over to Jen. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you everyone for signing on today. So before we dive into the impact of chronic absenteeism, specifically on homeless students, I wanted to just sort of lay the groundwork and start with making sure that we all have the same definition of chronic absenteeism. So chronic absenteeism is when a student misses 10% or more of school days, and that includes both excused absences as well as unexcused absences. And for most states, averages out to about 2 school days per month. Now, 2 school days per month might not sound like a lot, but the evidence in the literature shows that those missed days really add up, and that chronic absenteeism matters because it has an incredible impact from an educational standpoint on students. So some of these impacts, again, just sort of laying the groundwork for the overall impact of chronic absenteeism, and then we're going to talk more specifically about what we're seeing among students who are experiencing homelessness and housing instability, is among all students, chronically absent students are less likely to meet grade level proficiency standards across all of the grades. They're more likely to drop out of school. And a really important thing that we need to think about, because often chronic absenteeism rates are some of the highest ones we see are in kindergarten and first grade, and then again, very high rates in high school. Well, these absences in the early grades have been shown to really have a lasting impact. So in one study, they looked at chronic absenteeism among first graders and kindergartners, and what they found was that among students who are not chronically absent in either first grade or kindergarten, they had their third grade reading proficiency was 3.5 times higher than their peers who were chronically absent in kindergarten and first grade. And so to put this in a little bit of context, that is the difference in the study between 64% of third graders being proficient in third grade reading compared to just 17% of third graders. So there really is an impact that we see of that chronic absenteeism has, and it really is something that's happening across the grades. So part of what is the struggle and the conversation that needs to take place is that attendance matters at all grade levels. And we need to figure out how we can support families in terms of meeting their needs so that their children can make it to school. Another way that chronic absenteeism is really important is that attendance is often a warning sign for something else that's going on that is preventing a family, preventing a child from getting to school. And so when we see a child who is missing days of school repeatedly, one thing that's really important to consider is whether or not that child is experiencing housing instability and homelessness, because absences really are often this early warning sign of instability in a housing situation. And you'll see that in some of the data that I will be sharing from the Michigan case study that we have here. Next slide. So as most of you are probably aware, chronic absenteeism is not an issue that is local just to one state or one region of the country. It really is a national issue that we are struggling with as a country across all education systems in the K through 12 range. And so you can see this in the data that was released by the US Department of Education for school year 2015-16, and they estimated that almost 8 million students were chronically absent in that school year. So when you think about the educational outcomes that chronic absenteeism is related to, this really shows that this is a large problem that we need to be thinking about, and is really something that is, across the board an issue in the US. The good news about this is that as a result of some of the data showing the impact of chronic absenteeism, as well as the number of students who are experiencing chronic absenteeism, many states have now adopted chronic absenteeism as one of the measures that they are looking at on a regular basis, and they've submitted that as a measure that's included in their state ESSA plans. So along with the fact that now outcomes for homeless students need to be disaggregated, so we can see the chronic absenteeism and dropout and graduation rates for homeless students, as well as low-income students, as well as students with disabilities. This means that we now have access to this information in a way that can be actionable and really used for local planning and local interventions, which really is a huge step forward. Next slide. So this is what we did in Michigan. We used the publicly available data from the Michigan's Department of Education website. And we downloaded that data and looked at the rates of chronic absenteeism across these different student groups. And what we found, which is, I want to say, not only the case in Michigan, but is also something that the exact same trend is what I saw when I was working in New York City, was that homeless students had the highest chronic absenteeism rate of any group that was available for comparison. So they had rates that were higher than economically disadvantaged students, students with disabilities, migrant students. Their rates were 2.5 times the rate of their housed peers, and who are low income, and over 4 times the rate of their higher income peers who are housed. So there really is a stark difference. And the reason this is important is because it really shows the relationship between housing instability and missing school. And that is something that's critical to understand. One way that we've made the case for why this is such a critical relationship to think about in Michigan is the fact that half of all students in Michigan are either low income or homeless or housing unstable, but they account for 75% of all students who are chronically absent. So if you look at this chart again and see that the average of chronic absenteeism in the state is 16%, you can actually see that that average is really being pulled up by students who are experiencing housing instability. So if the state wants to see these rates going down, we need to be thinking at a very both from a statewide level and at a local level, how do we figure out how to meet the needs and better support students who are experiencing housing instability so that they can get to school? And that is a key part of actually seeing rates of chronic absenteeism across the state go down. Next slide. And the last slide that I want to share with you before passing the baton off to Sue, who's going to be talking about some of the actual interventions that are incredibly helpful to students and what she's seen be successful on the ground, is a way of really making this information that is now publicly available in many states something that can be actionable. And the best way to do that is to make that data available locally. Because when we look at the state overall, we do see this picture of students who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness. They're experiencing chronic absenteeism as well at much higher rates. But when you look at this at the school district level, there really is a huge range. So by school district, in some school districts, we had just 13% of homeless students were chronically absent. And in some school districts, we had 86% of homeless students were chronically absent. But that shows that chronic absenteeism is not inevitable for students who are experiencing homelessness and housing instability. There are things that can be done to improve attendance and to provide the supports that families need. Now, would we like attendance to be or chronic absenteeism to be lower than 13% for homeless students? Definitely in those districts, but 13% is lower than the statewide average. There is the ability to have an impact and to make changes and to see what's working at these local levels, which is why I'm so excited to be a part of this webinar today, so that we can hear about some of those local efforts and what is being successful across the country and in the state of Michigan. Another really important way of making this information relevant at a local level so that it's actionable is really to not only be looking at homeless students, but to be disaggregating the data by these different groups. Because what you see when you start looking at each district individually is that there are different situations. Some school districts are struggling with chronic absenteeism across the board. Students who are housed, students who are homeless, students who are struggling with disabilities, they all are experiencing chronic absenteeism at high rates. In other districts, however, you might see that the general student population is actually attending school at very high rates, but really there are just a few groups, for example, homeless students and students living with disabilities who might be really struggling with high rates of chronic absenteeism. And that can really guide us in terms of how do we direct our outreach and how do we direct our resources so that they are meeting the needs of those families and students who are struggling the most. And then the last thing that we've really found to be true in the work that we've been doing in Michigan here is that because there's such a strong evidence base for the impact that chronic absenteeism has educationally on students, this publicly available data, even though it's not linked to other outcomes like graduation or third grade reading score specifically, like even though you might just be getting your chronic absenteeism numbers for your school district, because the evidence is so strong that chronic absenteeism has an educational impact, you can really make a very strong case for why it's important to meet the needs of homeless students in your district by showing that they have higher rates of chronic absenteeism, which is, in all the data that I've looked at, is across the board true. So this publicly available data really does provide all these districts in 36 states that have adopted chronic absenteeism as a measure with an opportunity to really be advocating and thinking about what resources might be needed at this local level and making the case for why it's important to meet the needs of students who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness. I'm going to pass this on to Sue so she can talk about some of what they're doing in Big Rapids.
Hi, thanks so much, Jen. Hopefully everyone can hear me. First of all, I'd just like to say thanks so much for asking me to do this. I love the opportunity to participate in professional development, and for all of you social workers out there who maybe are just getting in the field and maybe have been in it for quite a long time, there's just really nothing that kind of trumps the ability to share some ideas with other people and to learn from each other. So thanks for letting me be part of this. I'd like to just start by acknowledging that all of you out there are human service people like me, and this might not be your favorite way of communicating. And so face-to-face always works a little bit nicer, but I'll sure do my best to communicate who we are in Big Rapids and what's important to us as we work with and serve our students and our families to try to get them and keep them in school. And our goal being, of course, to increase our graduation rates and to help the kids have a positive future. So Big Rapids is a small rural town. We have about just over about 10,000 people in our residents in our town. We're also a college town. We're home to Ferris State University. And so when school is in session, the university kids kind of double our population. And so that's kind of nice to have them here and to have what they bring to our community. We have 5 school districts within our ISD. We are all considered rural districts. We happen to be the largest, and we are just coming in at a little over 2,000 students in our district. So we're not very big. We're also not very diverse in terms of race or ethnicity. The picture that you saw on the screen initially is kind of who we are and what we represent. We do have about 70% of our kids who qualify as at risk, and so that's from our 31A data. We are, for our homeless kids, we do come in at about 16% of them who are considered to be at risk due to poor attendance. So that's the numbers that Jennifer was mentioning earlier, that 10% or more of the school days. So we're right at about 16% there for our homeless kids. So I really didn't realize until I was listening to Jennifer that we're doing not too badly in that area. Currently, it's only the first trimester, so right now we have just over about 35 homeless students in our district. I'm sure there are more than that. It takes some time to find out who they are and to bring them to the surface. Again, about 16% of them qualify as chronically absent, which is also what our district is. Our district comes in at about 16% as well. So those are numbers that we are always trying to improve. We do have several unaccompanied youth who are kind of on the borderline, so we need to keep an eye on them and make sure we're reaching out for them. So if we can go to the next slide. So when I take the time to really reflect on some of the common causes of chronic absenteeism among the homeless in our area, it's important to kind of make note of some of the key factors that seem to be repeated again and again as I listen to the stories, kind of the life stories of these families, in one way or another that seems to have led to their state of homelessness. One of the things, of course, that might not be surprising is financial disturbances in their lives. Maybe someone has lost a job for any number of reasons, but also some kind of falling out where their parents feel that they've ended up kind of with the short end of the stick in terms of a perceived injustice. That seems to be a common thing that I hear. The social emotional skills get in the way of these families, often even in the adults, and that's why they lose their jobs. Relational breakdowns in the intimate lives of the adults, divorce, domestic violence, infidelity, family ties, families, units that don't get along with each other. Sometimes a loss of a home because of an inability to pay bills or make rent payments. And often they'll move to our town or the neighboring areas. I was a homeless liaison in another district for 16 years prior to coming here, or I was there for 16 years. I was a homeless liaison there for about 9 of those years. They often will move into an area because of perceived low housing costs or to move closer to hopeful family connections. Some of the things that make them, that are really some actual causes of the homelessness among the students, I find that many of our families are really enmeshed in like generational poverty or even generational social distress. It's just kind of their way of life. They might not necessarily realize the position they're stuck in, especially with the social skills that are lacking. It's just kind of the way things are for them. The kids just don't always know or have role models who model those. If any of you have ever read anything about Ruby Payne's study on poverty, those the hidden rules of the middle class, they just don't have role models for that. The kids and the adults are easily overwhelmed by what we might think are really little things. Like, for instance, they may all have a cell phone with an alarm on it, but they might forget to set their alarms to get up in the morning, or they set the alarm, but they forget to turn it on. They might have poor health or hygiene factors and lack the resources for that kind of help. Poor relational skills, again, with like anger management, anxiety, depression. Children sometimes are the only ones in the house who have to get up in the morning. And so they're often getting up on their own and causing them to be late or miss the bus. That can just be a daunting existence that really has a big effect on their attendance rates. Then again, the lack of transportation. If they do miss the alarm or they miss the bus, they might have no other way of getting to school. And above all, they usually have a real mistrust of what they perceive to be the system. So they aren't going to reach out to us, contrary to what we might believe, that people are always asking for handouts and asking for help. They are not going to reach out to us. We are the ones that have to do the reaching and reach out to them. So those are just things that we have to pay attention to. So the next slide. Relationships. One of the big things that I just am more and more aware of as I continue to work in this field with young people and their families is the relationship component. And so first of all, it's important for you to know, like, homeless liaisons can't work on an island. The job is just too big. It's really huge. There's a legal mandate that every school district has someone designated as a homeless liaison. In our district, I actually am an assist. I help. There's two of us who work together to do the homeless liaison work. The other person, her name is Julie Aldrich. She's also a school counselor. She is actually on the books designated as our main liaison, but it is a big job. In Big Rapids, as in most small school districts, we all wear many hats, and we just really have to help each other. So relationships are critical if we're going to come anywhere near close to providing the kind of support that our homeless families need. We need to stay in touch with people like the secretaries, the teachers, the attendance clerks, food service workers, bus drivers, school nurses, the school counselors. Any one of these people can just make it or break it for a student. One of the most important things I can do as a homeless liaison is to really nurture those collegial relationships so that we can all work together as a team. I need to constantly be reaching out to those people, reaching out to the teachers, be available to them, reach out to the food service people, check in with the secretaries. The bus drivers are a great resource. They're aware that, oh gosh, I used to pick up only one family at this bus stop, and now there's two families, and they're coming out of the same house, or where they're dropping kids off. And the people that are out there are such great resources for us, and it's just so important that we keep those relationships nurtured, so that we have that connection as a team. The students are fragile. One adult can really make or break their sense of safety and belonging in your school, which can have either a positive or negative impact on their school attendance. And so we need to be open, and we need to work with an open heart to the circumstances I feel that these kids come from, and the need for assistance that the families require. So if we go to the next slide, we can look at some of the things that we've been doing in Big Rapids. So homeless students, really, they need the same things that all kids need. They need to feel a sense of connection. They need to feel like they belong. They need to feel challenged. They need to feel competent. They need to feel like they're part of a community. And they just may need a little more support to allow that to happen. And so I can share a couple specific relationship building strategies that I've used over the years. that I find make a huge difference in the interactions I have with the families. And so the one thing that I've been doing for a long time is something called Lunch Bunch. This is just simply a gathering of some kids during lunchtime. It seems to always be welcomed. Just to, for instance, take one student, maybe it's a homeless student, maybe it's somebody who's always just getting in a fight on the playground, maybe it's somebody who's just dealing with a lot of attendance issues, and I'm trying to find a different way to reach out to them. Kids love it when they have an opportunity to eat somewhere other than the school cafeteria. And I've always been fortunate to have a place in my office that's big enough. I just have a round table, and I just bring kids together, and just a small group, maybe 6 or 8 at the very most, but usually about 5 is kind of the perfect number for me for that, because what I like to do is be able to have a topic of conversation that we circle around. It offers a sense of belonging at the table. It offers a sense and I talk to the kids about, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to practice table manners, which is a skill that can take you a long ways. And we're going to practice dialogue and conversation manners. And that's another one of those social skills that are just often young folks are lacking in. And so we talk about successes and challenges and things, but often I will link our conversation. I'll have our topic be, have some real clear questions like, who are you? What's important to you? What kind of a difference do you want to make in the world? What do you want to be when you grow up? I mean, those are the kinds of topics that we talk about, and we practice our table manners and our conversation manners as we're talking. I can't tell you what an impact that has had on kids in all kinds of ways. It helps with their attendance. It helps them especially even with discipline issues. If they're the kind of kid that's getting in trouble a lot, that seems to make a big difference with them too, just to having that one little piece of time when they belong to a special community, even if it's just one day a week for a few weeks in a row. The other thing that I find is just tremendously helpful is positive phone calls. And that might be what I'm going to talk about is phone calls home, but positive phone calls to a teacher, to the food service people, to the bus drivers, to the maintenance people, whoever it may be. When you reach out with a positive message to someone just for some affirmation about what's going on and how they're impacting students, it makes a tremendous difference. What I like to be able to do is call parents either to celebrate a small success that I may have seen in their child, or to offer some kind of support. And even if I'm offering support, if it comes off in a certain way, if I approach the phone call under the umbrella of concern and empathy, then it's gonna come across as positive. I never want to penalize a parent. I never want to come across as though I'm penalizing them for whatever it might be, not having school supplies or not having their kids in school on time or whatever. I'm always coming across with the approach of concern and empathy. Empathy trumps everything. If there's ever a time when I can say something like, is your son like mine used to be? My son I would put him in the shower and he could be in there for 20 minutes and come out dry. And so, like, lots of times I'll have to talk with families about things like hygiene. It's a topic that nobody wants to approach. And I find the best way to do that is through some form of empathy and just offer real concern for my concern for them and for their situation, and just wondering how I can help. And if I come across in terms of being somehow having been at least a little bit aware of, or being able to have been in their shoes at one point or another in any way, it makes a big difference. So we really try to just adopt a whatever it takes approach in Big Rapids. We try to remove all barriers, get kids in school. If they don't have all the paperwork, it doesn't matter. If it looks like they're homeless, we get them in school right away. Whenever possible, we try to satisfy some of their basic needs. Like, for instance, I have some kids who have a shower bag at school. They don't have running water in their house. It's not considered a CPS issue. They have a roof over their head. They have a stable house. Right now, they don't have water. the kids are allowed to take showers at school. So a shower bag at school, a gym bag, school supplies, gym clothes, a warm jacket. We have lots of donations. Lots of our community members donate. And so we have a closet at the school where we can house those things. We always provide private transportation to and from the shelters. We have quite a few families who live in the shelters locally, and we provide transportation for them so they can get to and from those places from their shelters in a safe way. The other big thing I always keep in my office, and our secretaries keep in their office, is healthy snacks. We have healthy snacks that kids are always hungry. And it's just we have simple granola bars and things like that. And it's okay. It's natural for kids, especially young adolescents. And it's natural for them to be hungry. And I would say, in closing, that there's nothing quite like a kind word and a handful of trail mix that can really just work miracles. Is that my last slide, I think, Katie? So just
That's
in closing,
correct.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to say there probably isn't an absolute definitive silver bullet that would put any, an unquestionable end to chronic absenteeism for all of our homeless students. But being supportive and building supportive relationships is just simply essential. Some bullets that I put in when I did my blog guest posts, just some really simple one-liners that I have on there. Get to know the kids and their families, get to know the teachers, the office staff, and all the other folks who make this educational merry-go-round continue to function. Have compassion and work from a place of empathy. Seek first to understand. Follow the golden rule, and for heaven's sakes, just be nice. And above all else, always operate under the umbrella of dignity and respect. So that is what I have for you today, and I will pass the mic on to Joseph.
Sue, thanks so much. Joe, feel free to take it away when you're ready.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Boy, I'm lucky to follow both Jennifer and Sue, because so much of what I have to talk about, they've really gotten into some detail here. So I'm here to talk about Check and Connect. So it's kind of the structure you might implement or use to address chronic absence and homelessness. Okay, next slide. So when we talk about Check and Connect, we talk about it being a structured mentoring intervention. And so there's a structure to it that I'll talk about in just a minute. There is also, but it's not scripted. It is a mentoring intervention. We know that through research that the single biggest protective factor that a student can have in their life is a caring adult. And that adult in this case functions in the role of a mentor. And then Check and Connect is also an intervention. It's not designed for a kind of school-wide implementation, but it's really looking at those kids who don't have, those students who don't have a consistent adult. And we're bigger than school completion, and I mean, that is one of our goals, but we really want to promote students being engaged at school. So when Sue talks about the first thing is we have to get students to school, I agree. And then once they're at school, we have to get them engaged and invested in learning. Next slide. So just a little bit of history. We often end up, Check and Connect ends up on a list, a good list in some ways, of evidence-based interventions through the Wentworth Clearinghouse. Twice now we've kind of been given the, this will date me, the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval equivalent in research, and that our studies met the evidence standards and show positive effects for students staying in school. And so this is why we end up as a resource for many sites. Next slide. Again, when we talk about Check and Connect as an intervention, typically, and this depends on the site, Check and Connect National really doesn't have a say in this. It really is what makes sense for you. So it's looking at either at a tier 2, the targeted level of service if you're using the multi-tiered systems of support, or perhaps at a tier 3. It really depends. And so again, it's for that group of kids, that group of students that aren't being successful in school, which could be in fact due to chronic absenteeism and or homelessness. Next slide. So what we've learned in the last 30 years since Check and Connect has been around is that there's real power and value in personalizing the intervention for each student. So it's not cookie cutter, it's very individualized. As Sue mentioned, relationships are essential. The mentor's relationship with the student, the mentor's relationship with the family, the mentor's relationship with all the adults that interact with that student. That is essential. We've also learned that it's pretty important to have a coordinator at the site or district level to help mentors, to support them, because as Sue mentioned again, you can't do this work alone. And so it's support for mentors and then supporting the fidelity of implementation. And then we also talk a little bit about multiple dimensions of engagement that I'll talk about a little bit later. Next slide. So in the intervention, we talk about there being 4 core components. So this is the structure that we have. There's the mentor, and it's a mentor-based intervention. There's the check, and Katie mentioned this earlier. This is where mentors monitor data that we know is available to schools and that's amenable to change too. And so that data would be attendance and behavior and course performance. The Connect is the actual meeting between a mentor and a student that happens once a week, where they review the data, and then they might do some problem solving and some capacity building. It sounds a little bit like Sue's lunch bunch that we were hearing, kind of helping kids navigate school and perhaps home too. And then finally, we have a component that involves families, that inviting and informing and including families as much as they can be in the education of their children. Next slide. So one of the things that we first start with is we first kind of separate out what do we have an effect on, what can we change as mentors, and then what's kind of the nice to know information but we don't have an effect on. And so on the right, you can see that things that we can change is that we can work to change someone's attendance, their behavior, their grades, their extracurricular participation. And so that's where our mentors focus. The other side, the status risk factors, that's important to know from a reporting point of view and from a systems point of view. But again, I can't change the fact that you might be homeless, but I can work with you to get you to school, to affect your attendance and your behaviors and your grades. Next slide. Mentors, again, demonstrate caring, consistency, and genuine concern. I think this mirrors what Sue said. We really work on assuming having positive intent and being empathetic. The job of the mentors is to reduce the risk factors that are in place, such as mobility and homelessness, and focusing on and finding protective factors that are in the school and family and also in the student. And again, it's to help students navigate school and home. So when we talk about engagement, student engagement in Check and Connect, this is where we're a little bit unique in how we look at engagement. We think that, first of all, student engagement is really complicated. It's more than just raising your hand or looking at the teacher, making eye contact, or turning in your homework. It's really about, on the right side of that chart, how students think about school, which is their cognitive engagement, and how students feel about school, which is their affective engagement. And that's where mentors start, is how do students think about school and feel about school, because those two things have to be in place before a student will engage academically or behaviorally. So it's not a homework help program. It's really getting to the heart of how kids think and feel about school to make sure they're connected and engaged. Next slide. So when we provide training for sites on how to implement Check and Connect, we first of all talk about a readiness tool that we have developed that you have free access to this. I'll get to this a little bit later, but it helps sites think about what their need is, what their fit is, and what their capacity is to implement. We help sites think about what are some of the criteria for selecting students at their site, what does their site need, and then we also help them think about how they'll select mentors, because there are many different ways, at least 3 different ways, to select mentors, and depending on what you have available in terms of personnel and or funds, that helps drive the selection of mentors. Next slide. So again, we talk about when we implement the mentor making a long-term commitment to a student, checking that student data, connecting and personalizing the intervention to the student, and then partnering with families. Next slide. This is just a little bit of an idea when we give this presentation for people that are going to be mentors, especially existing staff. They often want to know, what are the jobs that I'm doing as a mentor, and what does a week look like? And so on average, what we tell mentors is that you can expect to spend about an hour per week per student that's in Check and Connect. Now that's not 60 continuous minutes, it's really 4 tasks that total about an hour, but it's spread out over a week. And so those tasks would include some communication with parents, looking at that alterable student data around attendance, behavior, and grades, communicating with the students' teachers, and then finally the largest chunk is connecting with students. One big difference you can see here on the chart is the green section, in that we spend more time at the elementary level communicating with parents than we would say at the secondary level. Again, I think we have found, even though our original study focused on high school students and graduation, more and more sites have adopted the mindset of early intervention. And so Check and Connect is being implemented across many, many elementary settings as a way to intervene early in the situations. This is just an example of some data collection that we have. We have a Check and Connect app that is used as a tool to help implementation. And so we look at, for example, data over periods of time. And this, for example, shows us that October looks like a pretty rocky month for this particular child's attendance. So just an example of that. And then on the next slide is how we would be able to show course performance data over a period of time. Again, there's a lot going on in this slide, but when mentors use the Check and Connect app, they can deselect courses. And so at the secondary level, you could compare and contrast 2 different courses to find out how or why some students are being successful in one course and having a challenging time in another. Next slide. Within the intervention, there are 2 levels to help personalize it. There's the basic intervention that I'll talk about in just a minute, and then the intensive intervention. And so on the next slide, we have that weekly meeting that happens between the mentor and the student. There's that sharing of the check data. There's some providing of feedback about that data, making sure that students know where they are currently in terms of grades, for example, where we expect them to be, and then that helping them develop a plan to get from where they are to where they need to be. So that providing feedback. And then we also, mentors take time to discuss school and help kids navigate any problems at school, and then to facilitate problem solving as needed. Intensive interventions, still within Check and Connect though, are designed to address what we would call a spike in the data. So when mentors look at data over a month and all of a sudden they are seeing spikes in data, an increase in absenteeism or an increase in behaviors, then mentors have to kind of dig in and then to customize and individualize the intervention even more. It could be a direct service, a referral to another professional or to an outside agency, but we also provide lots of examples for mentors to use. One of the first ones is to figure out, is this a can't or a won't issue with the student, because that often determines the direction of the intensive intervention. Next slide. Again, we pay attention to working with families, partnering with them. We often ask sites to consider these 4 categories and what they're doing right now that's working, and then also what they might do differently. And so how have they, for example, how are they enhancing homeschool communication? We know that schools do a really good job of sending communication to families. We would ask sites to look at how are families able to communicate to you at school. Home visits or off-site visits are powerful, and so we talk about that. We talk about how to respond to parents' questions or concerns, and then how do we encourage parents to support learning at home too. We also pay quite a bit of attention on how to monitor the implementation of Check and Connect, stressing the fact that if we want to replicate the results of the research, we have to monitor the implementation to ensure fidelity. It helps us identify ways to improve the program at the local level. And then, of course, we're always looking at outcomes or impact of the program too. Someone will want to know, is this working? What results are you seeing? And so we help sites work through that too. Next slide. So some resources that you have available to you that I will send a link to Katie that she can give to you is that we do have a self-assessment that sites can work through to look at the core components of Check and Connect and the elements of Check and Connect to see where they are right now. We have a mentor practice profile that describes what mentors do in Check and Connect, and then what does, for example, a proficient level of performance look like when you're a Check and Connect mentor. This supports the practice of the mentor and the fidelity of the implementation. And then we have another tool that we use where we ask coordinators to ensure fidelity is to monitor the mentor practice, kind of almost a dipstick of reaching in and seeing how mentors are doing and are they implementing with fidelity. Over the years that I've been doing training, these are some considerations that we ask sites to think about. Administrator support, for example, is critical to the implementation of any intervention or initiative. And so administrators don't have to be directly involved, but they have to be a source of support for sites. Data collection remains a challenge at many sites. Not everybody has access to all the data. There are ways to work around that, but we ask sites to consider that. Of course, time is always of the essence here, whether it's to provide initial training, weekly or monthly meetings with mentors, ongoing professional development. Everyone has to kind of work through those issues. Not insurmountable, but they're challenging. Changes in school personnel, administration leaving, teachers leaving, jobs changing, all affect implementation. Competing initiatives, interventions, and other mentoring programs going on. And then engaging families remains a challenge for many sites. And part of that challenge is that our expectations for what engagement for families looks like hasn't changed much. And so, and not necessarily, it hasn't changed for the better. We still expect families to show up to school and that measures engagement, when we know that that is not a guarantee of engagement, and that for many families, coming to school during school hours is not an option. And so we talk a lot about how do you engage families by setting aside that mindset that they have to show up. Again, it's assuming positive intent. Another way that sites implement is that we do have our manual online that you can purchase. It's written in a very user-friendly style so that you can purchase the manual and read the manual, and you can then operationalize it if you choose to do so. So many sites do that when they want to implement. And the next slide. Some sites do that, and then they also train their own mentors. Other sites prefer to have someone come in and do the training, and we can do that also. We have two versions of our preparation and implementation training. which is for leadership teams to kind of work through all of the concerns that you would have as a leader if you were going to implement this in your building. We have an online version, a live version of training, and then we have an in-person version of that. We also have at the bottom of the screen, you can see mentor training. So we have a 2-day version of that where we will provide training for mentors. And then finally, we have a mix of both of those. It's a little bit of the planning for leaders and a little bit of the mentor training, and that's our comprehensive training. And so those are just some of the trainings we offer through our contracted services.
Joe, thank you so much, and thank you again to Jennifer and Sue. And we have ample time for Q&A. So we've got just a couple in the questions pane, but now if you've had anything percolating while you've been listening to our marvelous presenters, feel free to go ahead and enter it in the questions pane. If you want to hear a little bit more about any of the components of the Check and Connect model in depth, now's your chance to ask Joe. If you want some, anecdotal examples from Sue, or to go into a little bit of a deeper dive regarding data with Jen, or anything, again, now is a great chance to ask some questions. The first question that I'm looking at, I know that Sue, Jen, and Joe all touched on this to some extent, but feel free, any of you, to go in to a little bit further depth. Wendy asks, is there any data on reasons students are missing school? So I know, again, we talked about, some of the general causes. I don't know if any of you want to comment on what you see happening more frequently, what the data reflects, what tends to be more true of students experiencing homelessness compared to other children and young people. Any thoughts on that?
I feel like that might be headed in my direction. This is Sue. I don't know that we necessarily, we keep track of, where kids have come from and different things like that, and whether or not they're doubled up with someone, or they're an unaccompanied youth, or they're living in a shelter. But when it comes to why they're actually homeless, those really are just kind of more anecdotal, this more anecdotal data that comes from conversations we have with those students and their families. So when I was talking about job loss and loss of their home, I think those are probably the most common in our area. But as far as keeping track of the data on that, that's not something that I have done, and I don't know if other homeless liaisons out there are doing that as far as what the actual causes are. It just tends to be more anecdotal, and it's on our enrollment forms when there's a questionnaire that they answer, and it just asks if they're doubled up with another family, or if they're living in an unfixed home like a camper or a trailer or something, and different questions that they answer. Just kind of check the box, or none of these apply. So other than that, we really don't have a way of collecting that data that I'm aware of in our district.
And this is Jen, just building off what Sue is saying. To my understanding, there's no uniform data that's collected across the board on this, like Sue was saying. I do think at times in local areas, there might be some data depending. And why I say this is, so for example, in New York City, there was data on the reason for entry specifically into shelter. So we wouldn't know as much about families who are doubled up. But one thing you could definitely take away from that data is that the reasons for entry varied a lot by community. So the main reasons would be eviction, domestic violence, loss of housing, due to some other circumstance. But how those stacked up really depended on the community. So I think one thing that could be useful is, taking some of, for wherever you are in your community, talking more to families and asking that question to get a sense of, what is the local context. because there isn't really a uniform data system for that question that I know of so far. But it would be great if there was.
Sue and Jen, thank you so much. This is Katie. I'd like to add that while it may not specifically answer the data component, because we've been focusing a lot of our work this calendar year at Education Leads Home on chronic absenteeism, as I mentioned previously, a lot of the resources on our website address issues related to chronic absenteeism and students experiencing homelessness. For example, tomorrow we're hosting another webinar that speaks to the issues faced by children and young people in rural communities who experience chronic absenteeism. So we'll be talking more in depth about why students in rural communities may, in some parts of the country, be at a higher risk for experiencing chronic absenteeism, what leads to those experiences. We've also published some guest perspectives and also have a recording of our webinar on the value of mentorship and how feeling disconnected from school can lead to chronic absence, as Sue and Joe both mentioned in their presentations. We did a webinar on model school shelter partnerships and how that can improve attendance for young people, and that focused on one particular model in New York City. So we looked at the urban component through that lens. And we're in the process of writing a whopping brief on pretty much all of our findings related to chronic absenteeism at the intersection of student homelessness. And we'll be publishing that sometime within the next month or so, so you can read more about our findings there. Unless anybody had more to share about that, I'm looking at our questions. We have someone asking how they can get more information on the Check-in Connect program. Joe, I know that in a couple of slides, we're going to be sharing the Check-in Connect website and as well as your contact information, but I don't know if you wanted to share anything in particular just regarding getting more information.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Yeah, I would say for the questioner, look at the last slide, and I think my contact information is there. Our website is there. Just one kind of note here, and I can send this later to you, Katie, is when you go to our website, there's a tab that says resources. And once that you click on that resources tab, you'll see all of the free resources that we have available for anyone to download. And so that monthly fidelity survey, the mentor practice profile, the readiness tool that's based on the NERN, the hexagon tool, all of those are there. And so there's information there along with information about trainings if people are interested in that.
Joe, you read my mind because the next question was asking for more information about the training sessions. Maybe you can speak to, how scheduling works, if there are fees associated with all training sessions, et cetera.
Yeah, there are, and we offer some different types of training. So we provide on-site training, meaning we'll come to you, and that usually involves a contract between the University of Minnesota, where we are, and the provider or the district that's hosting. So that's one option. We do offer trainings here in Minnesota, if you're brave enough to travel here. With the weather, so we offer those periodically too, and then we have that live training also. And so I would encourage you to please reach out and call or email me if you want to get kind of a head start on some of the information. Look at the training tab on our website, and that has a lot of information too, but we're more than happy to kind of talk through where you are in the process and what your needs are and your readiness for Check and Connect and how it might fit in. So lots of information on our website, but they can certainly reach out to me.
Joe, thank you. And that person had one more follow-up question, which I'm sure will be answered by the website, but she just wanted to know what comes with the training in terms of in-person support, follow-up support, books, materials, stuff like that.
Right. Right, in the training, so as part of the training, you would get the manual, the Implementing with Fidelity manual that I showed. You would also get a participant guide. You would also get access to a number of additional resources through a protected URL that we would have. And then many sites also, as part of our contract, we actually put into the contract a number of hours for technical assistance. So we're there to provide assistance before, during, and after the implementation. So those are just some of the resources that we would provide.
Joe, thank you so much. There was another follow-up question regarding costs associated with the training, but you already addressed that, and I know that there's more information about that on the website. We have another question from Michelle. Is there any data that shows, where'd it go? That shows what works to engage students when they really do not have any family or parent support? So I guess maybe we can answer this question, either looking through a data lens, or if you guys can share, if we're short on data on that, what you've seen anecdotally.
I was thinking maybe Joe was going to take that, but this is Sue. I'm just thinking, when our students don't have parents or anyone at home, then it kind of falls on us. I think the connection with a mentor is a great idea and a great support that might be available if you were able to do that. But making sure that they are feeling as connected as possible at school is going to be super important for those kids, and that they have access to, mentors or tutors or whatever when they're at school. But certainly there are times when the school is in the position of taking over for parents. Sometimes they might have other family that you could reach out to, but often that falls on the school to implement some of the kinds of strategies that we've talked about here today, I think. And Joe may have some more on that, because I think that mentor program would be huge for those kids as well.
Right, and I think it's part of it is also thinking about expanding our idea of what family is, and what, because I think sometimes we can get a little bit stuck into what we think. So many students have what you might call non-traditional family structures, and so if they're a supportive adult in that child's life, then that's good enough for me. That's who I'll work with. But you're right, Sue. The mentor does often become that one consistent person, and that's what makes it, awesome and frightening at the same time. In that we have a lot of kind of influence in that way, and that we are that significant person, that consistent person in a child's life, in many cases.
Thank you so much. Our next question is a big picture question, and the participant states that attendance is a big issue in our schools, and I would like to know how to get started on addressing this issue. Maybe some of you could speak to, we have the example of the Check and Connect model as an intervention system that can be applied to a school or a school system. But for schools or districts who are just really getting started on tackling the issue of attendance and absenteeism, what would you recommend as sort of like grasping your hands around it at the get-go?
This is Jen, and I just want to put out there, and I'd love for other people to take this from here, but I think the first thing that you need to do is to look at the data that you have, because you need to be able to bring everybody on board. You need to be able to look at where you're standing now and be able to figure out what's working. And looking at the attendance data and the chronic absenteeism data and disaggregating it to see which groups are struggling, I think is a critical first step, and also will really help to bring people together in terms of sort of having a direction of how are we going to address our resources, and then what interventions are going to be most helpful, because there are a lot of different interventions that are out there, but you want to be able to tailor those interventions to those who are in need. From there, I'm going to pass the baton out, but I think that's a good place to start.
So I think Joe mentioned it. Joe, sorry, I don't know if I'm talking on top of you, Joe. You mentioned the definition of engagement, and I think that's a really critical place to start. Once you've looked at all that data that Jennifer mentioned and try to disaggregate what some of the real issues are, and disaggregate the kids into categories of the types of absences and the amount of absences, and are they always tardy, or are they missing certain days of the week, or are they missing weeks on end, or whatever. But then to like for me as a counselor, I think reach out to your counselors and different people that may have access to those kids on a different level. And that notion of engagement being really how kids think about school and how they feel about school, and looking and starting there with some of them. We can look at data and see that research tells us that kids drop out of school somewhere between 3rd and 6th grade in their head. That's how young they're dropping out of school. And I recently, too recently, but a couple of years ago, I spent some time, just one day, inside a maximum security prison, and I was talking with the inmates there about public education, and they also reaffirmed, like, they were between 3rd and 6th grade when they dropped out of school in their head. They still came to school fairly frequently because that was the place where they could get food, and maybe that's where they felt the most family oriented, but they still were not connected to school in the kind of way that we need them to be connected so that they can continue to pass classes and graduate. So starting with what it means to be engaged, I think, is a huge place to start. Like, how do your kids feel about school? Right. And what's that connection?
And so you made me think of something else here. And again, this is another free resource that sites can tap into from our website. We have a student engagement instrument that addresses how kids think and feel about school, so that cognitive and affective. Again, if you go to our website, engage and look at the tab Engage, SEI, that's Student Engagement Instrument. It's a free resource that has 36 questions all around that to provide you with some of that data that Jennifer mentioned that perhaps may not show up in just looking at attendance. Another resource that I point sites to sometimes, and many people already know about, is Attendance Works. If you're looking for kind of big systemic things to think about, some of their work really got me thinking about chronic absence, and the whole idea is that when you miss a day of school, the day that you come back to school is really another lost day because you're just catching up. And so it's thinking about that, but they often have some great resources to kind of, for districts have to kind of wrap their heads around and perhaps try systemically.
Joe, Jen, and Sue, thank you so much. Our next question gets to the heart of the intersection of chronic absenteeism and truancy. And the participant asks, can you discuss chronic absenteeism and when it necessitates getting a student involved in the state legal truancy process, knowing that homelessness shouldn't necessarily be referred to that legal process? I will say before if any of you are going to jump in before any of you do so, that Education Leads Home is working on a webinar to discuss the distinction between chronic absenteeism, truancy, and overlap in issues. So you read our minds. We are going to be going there, and we have some presenters who work at the intersection of these issues to explain how to accommodate different populations. But I don't know if any of you have anything to comment on right now.
I'd just like to say, go. Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Thank you. In Check and Connect, one of the areas that mentors address are what we call policies, practices, and procedures that actually push students who are at risk of dropping out of school. And so elevating a chronic absence issue into a truancy issue would fall under that umbrella of elevating. And I realize that there are policies and laws in place that often drive that, but we really try to have mentors look at why students are missing school and getting to that as opposed to just that blanket kind of policy that you missed X amount of days, now you're truant, and we have to get all legal on you and everything. So we know that that's something that we kind of struggle with and we work with, that mentors do.
Yeah, and just building on that, this is unfortunately not an answer to your question, so I think we'll have to wait for the webinar, but definitely the research evidence shows that positive attendance approaches and policies are more effective at improving attendance than punitive approaches. So, you know, I think one aspect is really trying to see how much there can be a culture shift where you are away from more of the punitive approaches in terms of truancy versus chronic absenteeism and positive attendance.
Absolutely, I agree with both of you. And also, depending on your district, those people that are in charge of truancy are all unique human beings as well. We happen to have a fabulous truancy officer in our district who really spends a lot of time connecting with the kids, finding out what their story is, finding out what else is going on at home. She'll often call, touch base with me after she's met with them because maybe they need some counseling services and different things. So, but yeah, going all legal on them, as Joe said so nicely, is not necessarily going to help them build the skills they require to know how to get their kids to school on time. You know, that might put them in just kind of dig their hole deeper and make them a little more upset with the system as more than they already are. So not always helpful. But thank you.
Team, thank you so much. We actually have several more questions, which is great, but we are out of time. Do not fear for those of you who ask questions. So I'm going to be sending the remaining questions to our participants. They'll respond as appropriate, and then I'll arrange all of their responses in a tidy document that I'll share along with the recorded version of this webinar, the PowerPoint, and some of the materials that Joe mentioned earlier. So we will get to all of your questions one way or another, and I thank you so much for your patience. We just want to make sure we respect everybody's time today. For those of you who participated in this webinar both because you're interested in it and for the sake of CEUs, at the bottom of the screen is the link, and probably the easiest way to get that, since it's kind of gobbledygook, is to, when you download the PowerPoint from the handouts pane, to just go to the slide in the document and then copy and paste it into your browser. So just a reminder that until you complete the post test, and then score at least an 80%, you won't be eligible to apply for the CEU credit. And finally, we mentioned our respective websites during the course of the presentation. I know that Joe mentioned Attendance Works, and we have their website here, as well as the Everyone Graduates Center is another great resource regarding addressing chronic absenteeism. And here you can see all of our contact information. Feel free to reach out to me with general questions, and also questions specific to chronic absenteeism as it relates to students experiencing homelessness. But I know that our presenters have also very graciously and generously shared their personal contact information so that you can ask them questions as well. That wraps it up for today. Again, we'll be getting back to everybody with the remaining questions. If you have any trouble with the link or otherwise completing the CEU formality, feel free to reach out to me and we'll do our best to solve your problems. But again, we're so glad to have you join us today, and be on the lookout on our website for some additional materials. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Katie. See you.
Thank you, Katie.
Bye-bye all.